What's up, everyone? So this is actually a somewhat belated follow-up to an earlier video where I compared American and Chinese political philosophy. There was a section in that video where I said what I thought the highest political authority was in each country. I said in America, the highest political authority was law, and I said in China, the highest political authority was the CCP, who are held to the law to the extent that they want to be held to the law. And I saw a lot of comments responding to that video where people were disagreeing with me. They said in America, politicians and the wealthy are above the law, and they said in China, the CCP is below the law. And I didn't really see people articulate why they thought that about America. But I saw a lot of people say in China that the CCP is not above the law because Chinese officials are regularly tried for corruption. So I think I can see why people would think that, but I also think that in both cases, people are wrong. So what I was doing in that video was making a technical observation about each country's relationship with rule of law. So to understand what I was saying in that section, you need to understand what rule of law means. So today we're going to break it down. So what is rule of law? Rule of law has been traced as a general concept all the way back to Aristotle, who said it is better for the law to rule than one of the citizens. So even the guardians of the laws are obeying the laws. The word law here isn't the same thing as legislation. So before we go any further, we need to parse that out. The word law in this context refers to abstract rules of justice that sit above a community and bind it together. So law here is a higher, more unchanging thing that in modern times is typically embodied in a constitution. And legislation is something different. To lean on Francis Fukuyama's explanation, he described legislation as positive law. So legislation refers to new rules that are made by political authorities. And he continues to say, the rule of law can be said to exist only where the pre-existing body of law is sovereign over legislation. So you only have rule of law if you have a higher body of law that sits authoritatively above legislation. So any legislation passed has to be in accordance with that higher law. So if a society has rule of law, then even the people who have the power to pass legislation are not above the law because they're bound by higher law. There are many aspects of rule of law that people include when they talk about it, like saying that it includes property rights and having the law equally applied to everyone and administered in the same court system. But the least controversial aspect of rule of law is to say that it means exactly what it sounds like. The law rules over everybody, including the rulers themselves. To go to Fukuyama again, it means that we have rules that are binding, even on the most politically powerful actors in a given society. To go to Aristotle again, so even the guardians of the laws are obeying the laws. I'm going to spend the rest of this video comparing rule of law in America and China, because I think I didn't explain myself well enough in the earlier video, so this will elaborate on that. And they also happen to make great contrasting examples on the subject. So let's begin by looking at rule of law in America. Technically speaking, the highest political authority in the United States is the Constitution. In the United States, the Constitution exists first and creates government bodies second. As it says in the Constitution itself, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. Then the Constitution creates Congress, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And the Constitution grants them their powers, like the power to legislate. And when people take those positions, they swear to be bound to the Constitution. So presidents, for example, in agreeing to take their position, are bound by 4-year term limits. And Congress is bound by the Bill of Rights in the laws that they pass. So Congress can't, for example, pass legislation that abridges the freedom of speech. Why? Because it says it in the Constitution. These words literally have power over Congress. This wouldn't mean anything if those were empty words that didn't actually work in practice. But that is a mechanism that reliably works in practice. Our freedom of speech, for example, is reliably protected from politicians who might want to infringe on it, precisely because it says it in the Constitution. And presidents, to go back to that example, are reliably bound by 4-year term limits. So in that simple way, the Constitution has political authority over all citizens and over all political parties in the United States. And all legislation passed has to be made in accordance with it. At this point, you might say, fine, politicians in the United States are bound by the Constitution. But are they bound by legislation, which is a lower form of law? So if politicians are not bound by legislation, meaning they could break the laws dictated by legislation without being punished, then that would be a form of corruption. I'm not saying that doesn't happen at all, but if we care about quantifying that kind of thing, corruption indexes typically rank the United States as towards, but not at the top, among the best countries in the world. I typically see it ranking somewhere in the mid-20s among the 180 or so countries measured. So that's far from perfect and leaves something to be desired, but it also doesn't indicate that there's an epidemic of corruption happening in America. For better or for worse, I think that most corruption that happens in the United States is legal. And I think the reason for that is because if you're a high-profile figure in the United States, like a politician, breaking the law is a risky thing to do. Even if you can avoid being punished by the court system, we still have media that can report on it. And if you're in office, we have elections and can vote you out. So I think if most politicians want to engage in something that we would normally call corruption, they find legal ways to do it. And there's some great examples I could pick from here for legalized corruption, like relating to lobbying and rent seeking. But I think the most flagrant one is gerrymandering, which quite literally means that political parties rig elections in their favor by redrawing voting districts. But even when politicians in the United States engage in quote-unquote legalized corruption, they can only do it because the Supreme Court allows them to do it. So with something like gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has struck down other versions of it. They've struck down gerrymandering relating to race, and they've struck down gerrymandering if it gets away from one person, one vote. But so far they've allowed partisan gerrymandering, which they say is mostly because they haven't been able to find neutral language that would block it, and they haven't been able to find a way to quantify how much would be acceptable. So partisan gerrymandering so far has been allowed by the Supreme Court, but that allowance is temporary by design and could be revoked in future decisions. Which is all a long way of saying, if you see politicians manipulating law to their own benefit, that doesn't necessarily mean they're above the law. I'd call it the manipulation of law, and in the case of something like partisan gerrymandering, maybe an abuse of power. But as long as the court system has the power and the mind to be able to potentially check them, they're not above the law. So if people in Congress or if people in the executive branch have power over the judicial system, then they would be above the law. But as long as we have a powerful, independent court system, then they're not. So I think with the case of something like partisan gerrymandering, it comes down less to Congress being able to do what they want with impunity, and it comes down more to the judicial system maybe making a questionable decision. Let's talk about presidents. If I had to pick one place where in modern times American presidents have been remarkably unconstrained in their power, it's in the War on Terror. On September 18, 2001, Congress passed a joint resolution that gave the president authorization to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons that were deemed connected in some way to the September 11th attacks, which was also designed to prevent future attacks against the United States. And you could see the difference. You could see how relatively free the executive branch was to act if they could argue that as part of fighting the war on terror. But compare the freedom they have there to the constraints that they typically face elsewhere. So say, for example, if a president wants to pass an infrastructure bill, or if a president wants to, say, expand the number of seats on the Supreme Court, or if a president wants to block a certain demographic from entering the country, they're constantly blocked from doing what they want to do. If anything, American presidents are constantly criticized for not being able to get enough done while they're in office. And the reason why they're not able to get as much done as they want to get done is because their power is meaningfully constrained. And the basis of that constraint is legal. I think there's also a common perception that the wealthy in America are also above the law. And when people say that, I think they're referring to things like tax evasion and certain practices that go on Wall Street. But if that is what people are referring to, I'd argue that technically speaking, those aren't examples of people being above the law. Those are examples of people finding ways to avoid the law. On Wall Street, for example, as far as I can tell, people avoid the law by engaging in practices that are cutting edge, which here means they're engaging in behavior that we think probably should be illegal, but at the time of their doing it, it isn't, simply because the law hasn't caught up with them yet and regulated it. And the same principle goes for tax avoidance. If people are avoiding paying taxes, say through deductions or offshore tax havens, that doesn't necessarily mean they're above the law, because they're legally operating within the confines of the law. They're just finding an optimal way to do that to maximize their own personal benefit. Even if a private actor was somehow able to manipulate legislation, let's say through making massive campaign contributions to people in Congress, however problematic that might be, that doesn't mean that they're above the law, because the judicial system has power over Congress. So again, technically speaking, the only way to be above the law is to have power over the judicial system. So if you're able to somehow manipulate the behavior of the courts, or somehow have power over the courts, to the extent that they don't prosecute you or check you for behavior that would otherwise be illegal, then to the extent that you're doing that, you're above the law. Individuals can be above the law, and also I think demographics can be above the law. If a court system decides to reliably not prosecute some certain demographic for engaging in behavior that would otherwise be illegal. And that might be true for certain demographics around the world right now, and that might be true for certain demographics throughout American history. But if you think that that's true for wealthy people in America right now, I think you're being too cynical. If you're able to become wealthy in America, it's not like you suddenly don't have to worry about legal prosecution. Wealthy people do have to worry about being prosecuted in America. They're just probably better at getting out from under it because they're able to hire better legal defense. So however much of a problem that might pose in terms of our equality before the law, that still doesn't technically mean they're above the law. It just means that they're more adept at getting out from under it. If you're searching in your mind for exceptions to what I'm saying, if you're trying to think of examples of wealthy people who are able to be above the law to some extent, and you come up with something like Jeffrey Epstein, I'm not saying that those exceptions don't exist, but that's just what they are. They're exceptions that outrage us, and they're not the rule. The rule in America is if you become wealthy, you can reliably expect the law to be above you and not under you. So I'm not saying those exceptions aren't problems, but saying that wealthy people in America are above the law gets it wrong because it implies that that's the rule, and it's not. If I had to pick one demographic that I thought was above the law to some extent in America, where they could reliably break the law and not be prosecuted for it, I would pick police officers. But even that seems to be changing as we have growing calls for accountability and more transparency now, for example, with body cameras. That being said, the Constitution is still reliably the highest political authority in the United States, and law is reliably binding even on the most powerful actors in the United States. Which is why I say, in the United States, law is supreme. That's not to say that there's zero problems here, but that is to say this is both formally true in America, and this is also practically true. This is practically a mechanism that reliably works in the vast majority of cases. Trust me that I don't enjoy defending American politicians, or even, I guess, wealthy people, any more than you would. But to say they're above the law in America, I think is wrong and isn't helpful. So hopefully this ironed out my thoughts on that. Getting over to China. When I say in China that the Chinese Communist Party is supreme and law is under the control of the CCP, I say it for a very simple reason. The CCP has a monopoly on political power in China. Unlike the United States, where the Constitution exists first and creates government bodies second, in China, the CCP is just there. It exists first. The Chinese Communist Party came into power in 1949 after they won a civil war against the nationalists. From there, they took control of the government and they took control of the military, and they declared themselves the governing political party. And from there, if you try to rationalize why they're in power, the logic is circular. The CCP is in power because they're in power. So their being in power perpetuates their being in power. From there, you might say, well, they seem to have high public approval, so that's a legitimating basis for their power. If the CCP meaningfully set up some sort of mechanism where they would lose power if public approval fell below a certain amount, say 50% or so, then I would grant you that that would be some sort of legitimating basis for their power. But as of now, that mechanism doesn't exist, so it doesn't work. It doesn't logically work to say they're in power because the public approves of them, and they would also still be in power if the public didn't. Which brings me back to saying, they're in power because they're in power. The highest authority within the CCP is a leader who usually holds 3 positions at the same time: General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, President of China, and Chairman of the military. As of this video, that leader is Xi Jinping. Then below that leader, you have the Politburo, Congress, and everything else. The CCP doesn't allow any meaningful political opposition in China. So any political parties that crop up that are deemed a threat are banned, which means that the CCP effectively controls Congress. And Congress created their constitution, which is to say that the constitution in China was created by the CCP. The Chinese constitution has language that makes it seem like it's trying to establish rule of law in China, notably with the line, "No organization or individual shall have any privilege beyond the constitution or the law." But in practice, it's not a binding legal document on the CCP. And the reason why is because they're the ones with the power to interpret, revise, and enforce it. It says that Congress has the power to amend the Constitution and also to enforce the Constitution. And it says that the Congressional Standing Committee also has power to interpret the Constitution and also to enforce the Constitution. And again, these are both bodies that are fully controlled by the CCP. So in China, the CCP have power over the Constitution and not the other way around. The Constitution doesn't have power over the CCP. The CCP are fully in control of what it says, how it's interpreted, and how it's enforced. So the line in the Constitution that says no organization or individual shall have any privilege beyond the Constitution or the law is not binding in practice because there's no higher authority that can hold the CCP to it. So Chinese citizens just have to hope that the CCP hold themselves to it, and so far they haven't. There is a Supreme Court in China, but that Supreme Court is subservient to Congress. So the order of operations here is the CCP existed first, then the CCP created the Chinese Constitution, and the Chinese Constitution created the Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court is subservient to the higher organs of the CCP, so it does not have legal authority over them. Which is why I say in China, the CCP is the highest political authority, and law is below the CCP. The CCP controls law, and then citizens from there are bound by that law. Which is why people say there's rule by law in China, but there's not rule of law. The Chinese Constitution claims to protect free speech, free press, assembly, association, procession, and demonstration. But in reality, Chinese citizens don't have any of these freedoms. The CCP infringes on all of them. And the reason why is just because they're able to. There's no legal authority that can stop them. So if the question is, what legal entity has power over Xi Jinping? The answer is a long silence. Xi Jinping can choose to follow every law in China, but he doesn't have to, because nothing can force him to. So if you see CCP officials being tried for corruption, it's not because there's a higher legal authority than the CCP in China. It's happening because the CCP wants it to happen. The CCP cracks down on corruption because they don't want corruption. They know that it's bad for their image and it tends to hurt the economy. So they choose to make themselves accountable to the law in that sense. But if you're choosing to make yourself accountable to the law, you're still above the law. If the law was above you, you wouldn't have that choice. Which is why in China, the highest political authority is the CCP, even when it chooses to subject itself to the law. And that's all I've got for today. I know this isn't the most exciting subject, but I think it's important. And judging from the response to my earlier video, it seemed like this was worth clarifying and expanding on. Also, I know my upload schedule hasn't been the best. I get stuck in these kind of rabbit holes, and I'm trying to improve on that. So this year I'm hoping to hold myself to a faster upload schedule, but can't promise anything, but I'll do my best. Either way, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time.